Um, so, I mean, I'm going to start to, I think broadly the way I see it, maybe simplistically, is real world evidence has two kind of applications in a sense, augmenting the data that we get sometimes from RCTs, sometimes augmenting and giving us rich data on that. Sometimes it's completely as an alternative to RCTs in things like rare diseases where we just can't feasibly do that, and potentially more and more of an issue as we segment cancer populations into smaller and smaller groups through genomics and the like. So let's address that first issue. Sorry, the last issue first, as it were, which is about in
Yeah.
rare diseases and rare cancers. And so let me ask you about that.
This topic is perfectly fit with the pediatric cancer because this is the typical rare disease. Because by definition, rare disease is 1 out of 2,000. No, one sick person out of 2,000. And in childhood, the cancer has an incidence of 15 per 100,000. So it's rare disease. Sometimes there is not even an established treatment. So by definition, childhood cancer is a rare disease. And we need, since ever, the possibility to have, we have had the obligation to gather people, to gather diseases, to gather patients' information. And the real world data are of paramount importance for that, because without gathering data and experiences, we cannot have any, let's say, evidence. On one side, we rarely can perform fully randomized clinical trials. So we have to rely on sometimes observational studies, sometimes even gathering let's say, the single cases. For sometimes having seen 2 patients with the same disease, one becomes an expert. So the possibility to access to the data coming from real world is really important for us. It is not anymore a matter that someone of the of pediatric oncologists come up one day with a new treatment for a rare cancer. This is a matter of gathering the data, and sometimes this is difficult. So we are experienced already, and as you may know, pediatric cancer is the second cause of death for children after the accidents. So this is a real problem. I think that the data coming from let's say, from the hospitals or from the primary care hospitals, or in some observational studies can be very important. But we have to talk the same language. We have to have the same tools, and in this direction, also the GDPR is very important to be, let's say, fine-tuned, because I will talk later on this. We have had this survey from SIOP Europe professionals stating and reacting that unfortunately for some of our trials, the GDPR implementation has represented sometimes as slowing down the process. So I think that pediatric cancer is the exact example where we have been gathering already since 40 or 50 years. You may know that pediatric cancer is considered one of the most successful stories in cancer treatment. And we are proud of this, but we were obligated to do so, to gather the data and to have also cross-border information. And this today is coming more complicated. And this is why our society is working to deliver a better way of gathering information together with the patients and parents associations. So I think that this is very important. For us, for all the diseases, you have to calculate that there are about 6,000 to 7,000 different rare diseases in humankind. And in childhood, there are more than 100 different cancers. And again, we need to have these cancers all together, the information gathered all together, because otherwise we just treat the patient on the basis of, sometimes feelings.
Sure. So I will come back to some of those points, because it makes the way you describe it sounds like, at least in pediatric oncology, there is some degree already of harnessing that data, that there is some data sharing going on, exactly, which may act as a model for how we need to do it more broadly.
Yeah.
But so we can come back to that. Philippe, the other sort of application, if you like, of real world evidence that I talked about is to augment the RCT, so not to replace, but to augment the the randomized clinical trial, and enable us to evaluate in a more rich way innovations, but also evaluate in a dynamic way as well, so we can review them. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? And
yes, I mean, this is very important. I mean, first of all, RCT remains the gold standard to assess efficacy and safety of a treatment in a very controlled population, where researchers can, minimize the influence of external factors. But real-world evidence will bring a different set of information in a much more heterogeneous population, and can bridge with what RCT cannot. So I think both RCTs and real-world evidence has distinct value that can help to better decision-making for regulators and payers. If you look at real-world evidence, what can they bring in addition to RCTs? I'm going to give a couple of examples. First of all, it can assess the real effectiveness of a treatment in the real setting. Because if you are an RCT, you have a protocol, everything is controlled, the numbers of visits, and that's not typical care. Patients sometimes miss their pill, they don't come to doctors don't practice all the exam, side effects are sometimes less reported, discontinuation rate could be higher or less, depending. So for, I should say, a government or an institution, having the impact of the treatment in the real situation is a valuable information. Another example that real-world evidence can bring is it could explain the efficacy or the safety of the treatment in populations which are excluded from the RCT. I would say frail, the comorbid, some ethnics. Sometimes, the Asian, North American, Black Americans, they have difference, and they're underrepresented in many RCTs. Even though companies are doing a lot of efforts to increase the diversity, there are some population. So that's also important for doctors to know, if the drug will have the same quantity of effect. Another important element is sometimes when you design an RCT and it is a long trial, 5 years, you start with a treatment which is the standard of care, but when you reach market, there is new treatments. So having a collection of data of your treatment that has been evaluated versus standard of care, vis-a-vis now new practices, make relative judgment that could help decision makers and doctors to make the right trade-off for the patient. That's another example. An important element also is to address the uncertainty of the efficacy of such very innovative medicine. I could say CAR-Ts, gene therapy. Sometimes you give an injection and you see the effect over 6 months, but what will be the effect of 3 years, 4 years? Only real-world evidence properly collected could answer that. Because at time evaluation by regulators or payers, the exposure will be too limited. And the mechanism of conditional approval or conditional reimbursement is inherent to real-world evidence collection in the long run. And a last thing, which is also, if you use large database like Project Darwin or the Future Health, European Healthcare Hub, you apply machine learning technique, you can find patterns of response in population that, just one single database could not apply. So what I would say is opposing the two data sets is probably the biggest mistake we can do. It's a continuum. They are different in nature. They are addressing different answers, but both are valuable sources. But you cannot apply to real-world evidence the logic of an RCT because there is no randomization. But there are, so you cannot, most of the time when you go to some HTA, they say, well, you don't have done randomization of your real-world evidence. Yeah, who's going to randomize the doctor to say I'm treating this patient or not? So understanding the inherent limitation and utility of real-world evidence is critical. It doesn't say that you should not have high-quality real-world evidence. I would say proper protocol, transparent methodologies, ideally prospective versus retrospective, working with academic registries, to limit any. Those are, I mean, must-have. That sometimes I have to say that the industry or even the researchers are not doing. So we have to also, I mean, clean our house sometimes because some real-world evidence are not that good. But if we do that and there are proper research, there is no way that those two data sets could not be useful.
Yeah. It does make me think, I've not quite thought of it this way, but it does make me think there's almost a mirror image risk to both industry and the payer here, because for the payer, it could mean that you adopt things early, so you're expending more, adopt things early, but the payoff might be that you will be able to get rid of, weed out things with poor efficacy. For the industry, it's the converse, exactly the mirror image, that you might get early adoption, but quite often the things you're talking about usually erode the apparent efficacy of a medicine. Broadening the patient group, the fact that patients might miss or that there's poor. So, I mean, it's all to the patient's good ultimately, which is what we're for. So I think that's. But it's just a thing that we, I guess, have to navigate both as a payer and as industry. Is that it is a change dynamic? I mean, it's just an observation, but I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
No, I think you're totally right. I mean, we should not be afraid of measuring the effectiveness of our drug in the real life situation. And if we don't deliver on the promises of benefit that we have seen in RCTs, then, I mean, we should be rediscussing with the regulators and the payers, because if the drug is misused or the drug is not fulfilling the promises because the population is, for example, have an ECOG more than 1, which is most of the time they are excluded from a trial, then, I mean, I could understand the payer says, what I'm paying for.
Yeah.
So, but this speech is not that common and not really yet popular, I think, but we need to provide value for money, and the payer is willing to pay for something which is really effective. And we have to demonstrate constantly that our value is there. And in oncology, I mean, as you said, I mean, the speed of innovation and the speed of science is so important that something is valid 1 year, and for the good sake of the patient, a new innovation is coming. So if you are not anymore valuable, then you will be obsolete.
Yes, I suppose it points to the fact that there needs to be a collaborative dialogue so that you can reach into the system and say, it's being misused, let's change the way it's being used so that it delivers. Yeah, so that's interesting. Sorry, I'm going on. Please, could you address sort of what the role of government and of ministries should be to enable, because clearly this has to be an interaction between industry, between clinicians and academic centres and the public sector.
Thank you. Yeah, I've noticed that not too many from the ministry, so I'm the bad guy referring to the legislation. But anyhow, I think that as we have noticed, not in Finland but other European countries as well, that the government role is very crucial because there is a lack of coordination. And the one thing is, well, I'm not always being the bureaucrat, but before, let's say 6 years ago, I was working at the Helsinki University Hospital, and I'm a geneticist by training, and I was working at the Comprehensive Cancer Center, and in that sense, we noticed really that even though we say that, for example, Finland is a small country, 5.5 million people living, but if you think about the space, it's really huge. I mean that it takes 16 hours from the southern part of Finland to travel to the Lapland when the Santa Claus lives. So that we noticed that what about those people living in the rural areas? Do they have the same opportunities to participate to clinical trials? No, comparing to those people who are living in the university hospital area. So we noticed that it's really there is a lack of coordination, and there is a crucial role for ministry. And not only the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, but for the whole government, and not only for making the legislation, because of course the ministries are the only places where that is the legislation is made, but as well, or financing and steering, so that we do wish and hope that that if every nation have that coordination, I think then it benefits the whole Europe when we are referring to how to strengthen the Europe and the data. And for example, we comparing, or let's say we look at the results of the survival in Finland, and even though, as it was shown by Francesca, those results from OECD, there are lots must be done. If you think about the equality, okay, if you think about the breast cancer patient, their 5-year survival is something like over 90 in Finland, but what about the people living with the pancreas cancer or liver cancer? Totally different situation, so must have to be done. And but the data, as we know, the data is that nowadays oil, and we noticed that we really have to collect the data, and not only the all the health data is in electronic mode, which is must be in that sense, but as well the genomic data. I'm just referring to the previous speaker, to Sachs, is very sensitive, and that's why it has to be strictly regulated. And we, by the way, just have the genome law at the parliament at the moment, and we have this legislation for secondary use for social and health data, which is very important. So we can use the data for innovation use as well, not only for primary care or primary cause, or as well for other purposes. And I think that is very important when we think about how the data can be used and collected and the benefit the patient. Even though it's sensitive, there must be some, as we do know, some let's say, not only the legislation, but as we know, the first thing is that the citizens and patient trust is the first one. Of course, we have to take account. If we lose that, we lose everything. And as we know that when we are talking about the very sensitive data, when you lose, for example, the data of genomics, if you lose that in the, let's say, we have already seen some examples, you lose it forever. So that's why you can't get it back. So that's why I think we have to have these discussions, and we have to have very, let's say, multidisciplinary teams where we can really discuss what are the goals and what are the, let's say, those things that narrow us to use the data. Probably this was too long. But
No.
Yeah, but
I mean,
anyhow, so
what you mentioned about that data being collected and being open for academic research and for clinicians. One of the sticky things that comes up quite often is the relationship of that data to industry, to the private sector.
Yeah.
What's the Finnish approach to enabling the likes of Takeda or others to access or to be able to get involved in that data?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. We really figured that out and noticed that our ministry ourselves, we can do that. So that I think the one very good thing was that the government decided to have 2 strategies. And one strategy was health growth strategy for research and innovation activities. And it was this interministerial collaboration where there was a Ministry of Culture and Science and Education and our ministry, and then the Ministry of Economy and Employment, and 2 very big financiers, Academy of Finland and Business Finland, all together were figuring out what is the possibilities to really support research and innovation. And I think that was in a way very, let's say, the very crucial for to support that kind of a project, for example, as FinGen, which is collecting 500,000 genomic material from Finland, and there are already 20 companies involved. So I think that is one very good example how government can support, or let's say under that umbrella, support innovation for benefit the patient.
Do we have any questions or comments on the floor? Okay.
Maybe if I can, I just want to elaborate on the issue of randomized clinical trials and the speed of the clinical trials. Sometimes you have to think about our situation as pediatric oncologists. We have very successful treatments. We have very few failures, very rare diseases. And when we start a trial, in 5 years, we have new drugs and new procedures. So this is a very important problem, because when we started the CAR T cells trials, for example, which is something that is astonishingly effective in the selected patients, because the real world thereafter showed something different. Because the problem is just in brackets. When I treat a patient in a randomized clinical trial, I almost treated, healthy patients, because they don't have any, liver diseases, renal alterations, or anything. So this is very difficult. When we then apply the treatment on the real world, where there are patients with renal insufficiency, liver diseases, and they have, they're fragile, this blows up in a completely different outcome. But coming back to the previous one, the real world evidence is very important for pediatricians and for rare diseases, because we have children that have to live maybe 60 or 70 years more. So we have a problem in transferring the patient to the adults, and we have a problem to survey how these patients will survive their cancer disease and their treatments. So this is very important. So this is a matter that we have to go beyond the usual randomized clinical trial. Sometimes we have to let me say creative in sometimes to find the way to get the data somewhere, clean data, and then take some decisions, because otherwise we will never progress anymore.
And I mean, real world data can be applied at many different points during if we talk about the innovation pathway for medicine, for example, right at the beginning of our R&D, at the regulatory stage, we could be incorporating real world at the access HTA stage, and then of course to review its implementation in the real world and to look at its effects in the real world. So any sense of where we're strongest at the moment and where we need to expand to, where the priorities are? I mean, maybe this is a special example that you're talking about in pediatric oncology.
Sure. If I just can make some additional comments, and is a matter of finding the right language for gathering the data. But this is true for pediatric oncology, it's true for rare diseases. If I have the data, I can use then artificial intelligence, machine learning, but without the data, this does not help at all. Because machine learning, artificial intelligence are beautiful words, but without data, that do not exist. Do not exist.
And huge amount of data.
And huge amount of data.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So I think that this is something that we have to go beyond with the regulatory bodies, with pharma, and because we have to find the way to exploit each single information coming from the real world, because there is no way for many rare diseases to start a clinical trial.
So should we be this came up in that we had some private payers and private providers. Should we be incentivizing, reimbursing, or even mandating the generation of data from our health systems that is in a fit state, clean enough and in a fit state, and see that as part of the responsibility of the health system, beyond delivering clinical outcome or looking after the patient, but actually delivering data on what's happening as being a fundamental responsibility of the health system?
Well, for the moment, I mean, the weight of evidence is put on the pharma industry to continue to demonstrate that the value of the drug is still there. I think a collaborative approach with institution and I should say governments or HTA bodies will probably be beneficial, because there is, if you put everything on the pharma to generate, there is always a suspicious that it is biased or is it driven by interest. So what I would like to see, if either like in Finland, some sort of consortium supported by government funding to bring every players into a collective effort, or regulators or payers to certify some databases that are sufficient quality that could be used as the source for validating some of the decisions. I think there is some tentative about connecting different large databases across Europe. But the problem of putting all the efforts on the pharma is a bit unfair, you know. Having said that, there is multiple ways that, coming back to your point, because they're very important, where do we are good at? I think in the early phase, we are trying to create some historical control reward cohort that could match the population that we want to study. And I want to say that we should go beyond pediatrics, because tomorrow cancer will be a rare disease. The genomic profiling of each patient make them that they will be different. Yeah. And we, for example, in NLSC, so we are developing a drug for EGFR mutation exon 20 insertion. Yeah, right. There is only 1% of full NLSC. So, and there is about 400 patients in Europe. So even through running a trial is going. That's where we could do good job is when we give access to our drug in a compassionate use prior to approval. I think here it's an easy win to collect the data and even provide that at different time points. Post-approval, I think this is where probably academic registries could play a role, because mobilizing a company for long-term efforts without any clear return is probably more difficult, unless there is an incentive to maintain price or reimbursement because it was conditional. So that's the way I could see. There is different response to different issues. But the last point I want to make in this panel is the problem we face, the major problem, is we don't know how those real-world evidence is weighted into the decision-making by regulators and payers. We don't have an algorithm or a proper guidance to say this data is good and will be considered as half good as a RCT. Well, and then until that, we turn into circle. So we need now a space to collaborate with payers, EMA, with UNETA, all those, to say, okay, let's do it properly.
I think we're going to hear a little bit about that from one of our questioners in a minute. But Parker, do you want to go first, and then Anya, and then this gentleman? I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but we'll come to you. I think we've got about 10 minutes, so we should be able to get through all three, I hope.
Thank you for ending on that point about collaboration, because I've got a pediatric cancer question. And I'm really grateful for your commitment to pediatric cancer, but I think that cuts across policymakers and pharma, drug discovery. So, I mean, you know, the kids are essentially triply cursed because you can't really do early detection on them. They have low tumor mutational burden. So a lot of IO is out, and then there's a market failure in kids. But it seems that the great hope is that all of this investment that is going into tumor-agnostic drugs could fund stratified drugs for driver mutations moving from adult into pediatric care. That would seem to require this kind of collaboration that Philippe is talking about, where pharma are supported by policymakers to give much wider scale compassionate access to stratified drugs to the pediatric community, so that you can really leverage all of the innovation in adult cancer that's never going to be affordable in children's cancer. I'd love to hear if that is something that you think could be driven in Europe.
No, thank you very much for the question, because this is a very important question. The so-called agnostic approach, which is basically what we also call the basket trials, where we have a target, then we have a drug, and we find the target in several types of cancer. So this is clearly one way we can go, and to reduce the number of patients needed, because if you look at retinoblastoma or maybe even rarer cancers, we will never get there. I'm not fully convinced that hitting a specific target will cure the disease. You know, cancer is not a disease of one single hit. If you look at the adult cancer, there are thousands of genomic alterations. In children, this is less frequent, but still is a problem. But this is the only way to go for, targeted therapy. This is one road we are already within SIOP Europe having as a priority. The other one is we cannot anymore bear the fact of the 18 years old threshold, because we are tightened by the 18 years. So can you think that the 18-years-old patient, for me, as a pediatrician, cannot enter a trial of adult oncologist because the other ones are 18 and 1 day? This is something that we are battling a lot since ever, and we hope that we can decrease the threshold of age to something that at least is 14. This will allow a lot of our patients who are the solid tumor patients who have the worst outcomes to get very quickly to the new innovative drugs. So coming to your question, it's very important. We are running through this targeted therapy. I'm not completely sure that this will be the solution of cancer in children, but we will have responses also for them. Then the 18 years old is something that we are completely, working on, and I hope that this will be changed in the next future.
Thank you. Question there. Yeah. I think we're going to hear a little bit about HTA and real-world evidence.
Yes.
Yes.
Because I think as much as I agree that when it comes to potentially effectiveness assessment in the real world, which is a different effectiveness than what you have ever seen in the RCT, it's not fit for purpose for the HTAs. And we discussed it, the simplest of all questions is what is the quality of life of patients, and we can find that information in a single data source in Europe. There's almost no one collecting this information. It's a core element of the HTA assessment. So the real-world data of today is not fit for purpose. The real-world data of tomorrow is something we create. So hence, the European Health Data Space has really to start focusing on the entire spectrum of users. And I think it should then also include, obviously, the industry, because nothing is more frustrating than sitting, for example, in an approval discussion for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, to hear that the company is saying that we don't get access to the patient data that we would need to convince you to approve our drug because the patients don't trust us. Hence, we need to find the neutral middle ground. And the European Health Data Space has to be that neutral ground where the patients trust us as regulators and HTAs and payers, as a matter of fact, enough to give us the data, because that's a societal perspective we have been talking about in other sessions too. And the place where you can actually really discuss what is acceptable or not is this famous joint scientific consultation, of which we have very few spaces. The HTAs don't have the capacity. We all agree on that, and we have to change that. But that's exactly the time point where you're also coming into that problem that you discussed first. If I generate real-world data concurrently with my RCT, am I going to shoot myself in the foot? Because the regulators will suddenly be interested in the real-world data that they didn't be interested before. But when it proves to be poorer effectiveness than in the RCT, what are they going to do? And that is really, this is the line where we have to change the rules of engagement, I would say. You have to be allowed to generate data for a different stakeholder so that the regulators are not allowed to punish and penalize you for that data. Because that is a very relative fear of the industry, and I think they are correct in that point.
I think both of you will be interested to comment on that. Maybe you as well, but I think let's go.
Well, first of all, the patient voice is absolutely critical, and I totally agree with you that in current HTA process, even in the joint clinical assessment emerging policy, the voice of patient is probably too limited, and this is a shame. The second thing is around the PROs or PROM. Sometimes when you include that into your RCT, you compare, for example, monotherapy to a combination therapy, which is the experimental arm, and you come with a conclusion that quality of life was not better in the combination arm. Most of the time, your regulators or HTA will say, well, there's no benefit. But I mean, this is totally wrong. I mean, if you have a monotherapy and you combine chemos, I mean, just having not the deteriorative effects of combining two toxic drugs is already a benefit while you have superior efficacy. So that just to say that there is misconception on that. Last but not least,
it makes the market more competitive as well to have another.
Yeah, but I mean, if you take, I mean, cancer drugs are not, mild drugs. I mean, they are toxic. If at least you don't increase toxicity, but you increase efficacy, it's already a very good thing for the patient because he feels better. Last, but I think back to your the point of generating data between RCTs, I think there is an opportunity with the early access policies in some countries, like in France, which is now allowing drugs to be used and funded from approval or even earlier. Then you could generate data on real life with PROs that, yes, that could jeopardize at some point your RCTs because you will have a much more diverse population, but could come also answering some of the questions that regulators and payers will have, which are not answered, and close the door for the innovation, which is a shame. So I think, all strategies needs to be assessed, but I'm pretty convinced that having real-world data in part of the decision-making with the right proper method is beneficial for patients and not the opposite.
Well, I think that the whole healthcare system, or let's say the healthcare, is challenged because of the personalized healthcare or personalized medicine. Are we ready for that? Because, because I think there are plenty of challenges that be solved, and we need the data. If there is no data, we can't tailor anything. So I think that is a big question. Are we ready for that? And what are those things we are ready to achieve and to solve? And I think that one of the things is that we do say that that patients are in the center, but I noticed when I'm working in the Comprehensive Cancer Center, we had a scientific advisory board, but we didn't have patient advisory board. And usually I say that was the best thing I did, that I established a patient advisory board. We pick up hand by hand our patient from the hospital. And I think that because we ask them that, are we doing the right clinical trials? What are they waiting for and hoping for? No, we weren't. So that I think that there are really big questions that has to be tackled, and that's why we need multidisciplinary team. And I think it's great that you point out the European health data space, because we really hope a lot from that.
So I think we're probably out of face-to-face. That's great. We also have another session, which is the next session is about regulatory and access pathways and accelerating those. So I don't know whether your question might be relevant for that as well. In which case, I'll take your question first. So. Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.